I talked to Tom Whitney about 1968, and he said you guys had a terrific political partnership. He was running for supervisor.
Tom Whitney has got a place in my respect that's second to none. Tom, the background of Tom and how he's come up and raised himself up with the bootstraps and the education that he's got off of it, but the way that he always had the sensitivity to people was second to none. And yes, we did. Tom and I, he and I laugh about it, but you keep in mind of the fiasco that the Democrats had in the convention in Chicago in 1968, and he and I had walked door to door on the east side of Des Moines together, and we'd go to the door and they'd slam the door in place. They didn't want anything to do with the Democrat at that point just because of the convention. But when it came time to vote, the fact that we went door to door and campaigned together really paid off. But Tom and I were very, very close and had very close political allies. And to this day, that Tom Whitney is an individual that I have a tremendous amount of respect for.
When you got to the legislature, was it set up like it is now? Because you mentioned there was going to be a change coming in '70. Were there 100 House members, or was it a different number?
There was 110 House members before we were elected, but then they cut it back to 100 in the 1968 election, so it was not as many as been there in the 1966 election, but it stayed the same as what we have today.
During the time you were in the legislature, were you ever in the majority?
No.
And you were dealing with Bob Ray, who was a brand new governor, right?
That is correct.
Anything that you recall that was really significant during that 4 years that you were proud of with regard to legislation?
Well, because of my background in city law, I got the opportunity to immediately work on the home rule bill for cities and towns, and they allowed me to carry that on the floor out of the minority, which I was very appreciative of. Chuck Pelton and I actually were the authors of that bill, but then when we got into the financial part of it and the bonding of it, Ken Haney of the Allers firm was the one that I relied upon, and they allowed me to have Ken as my assistant on the floor and carrying the bill, and that was especially true through the buying portion of it, which was quite a thrill to do that. And then that summer, after the after the bill was adopted, I went around the state with Phil Riley, who was the city attorney for the city of Des Moines, and we went to the cities across the state to explain what the bill would do, what it was, and held conferences on it. And that was a real satisfying experience.
Were you serving as a city attorney at that time too?
I was city attorney in Altoona at that time, yes.
You understood that the cities needed to have some freedom to accomplish some things financially and also...
Well, up to that time we'd been operating under the Dillon Rule, and simply what that meant was that the only thing a city could do was what the legislature said they could do. We changed the Dillon Rule to just the opposite. The city can do anything within its power that's not limited by the legislature. And so it was a total reversal of where we've been. And yes, it opened up the state for development that it wouldn't have had otherwise, because it allowed cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids that they could go their own direction and do their own thing. And candid with you, one of the first things that I saw of how important that was with the construction company here on Broadway of Field's Construction, of where they manufactured the forms called economy forms, if you remember.
Oh yeah.
That allowed us to institute bonds so that we could build the forms here for the nuclear plants across the world. And they were done right here in Des Moines, and we wouldn't have had that had we not had home rule. So it was one of the first things that I got to see done. And candid with you, that everybody else was afraid to touch the bonds on that, which were going to be revenue bonds. And we did it in the city of Altoona, and they took the ordinance that we wrote here in the city of Altoona and took it to Ohio and used it on Ohio immediately afterwards. So it was something we were very proud of.
Well, no, that was a very important change that still exists today.
It is.
What about tax increment financing? Were you involved in that too?
No, that came afterwards. The answer to your question, no, I really wasn't.
you were reelected in 1970, and did you decide not to run in 1972?
No, I'll tell you, in my second term, I run for minority leader after Bill Gannon had decided to run for governor, and I run for minority leader, and I got beat with one vote by Dale Cochran, and I said, that's it. Okay. And that was my last public office within the political field. I served as head of the school board here in Southeast Polk after that, but I didn't run for office anything else after that.
So it sounds like you have two children that have followed in your footsteps to different areas. Is that right?
I hope that they have the sensitivity for the rest of the citizens like I did, and they obviously do. And yes, I'm very proud of them.
And you have one served on the school board.
Brad served on the school year. Keep in mind that the Southeast Polk School Board, my grandmother served on the Runnels School Board and was the instigation of hiring the county superintendent that really got Southeast Polk started, and then Neil Smith and Ed Fox took that over. And so Ed Fox and my father served on the first school board, and then I served and my son has served. That's correct.
All right, so 1972, you decided not to run for the legislature anymore. What did you do next with Democratic Party politics?
Well, I've stayed active in the party from that day forward, as you will know. Yeah. I hope you know.
Oh, no, I've been a mentor to me. Let me ask you a little bit about some things that you got involved in. Were there any special campaigns? We'll talk a little bit about the Edwards campaign in a second. You know, regardless.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But any other campaigns that you really played a major role in? Let's just talk a little bit about that. 1976, did you get involved at all in any of the campaigns that came to Iowa? Because that was a big year for Democratic Party politics.
Yeah, the answer to your question is yes, and that you know that I have very fond memories about Jim Maloney telling me about this cotton farmer from Georgia that was going to run for president of the United States and named Carter. And I had a guy come into my office when he first came to Des Moines and said, Ed, you got to go meet him. He's going to be the next president of the United States. And I said, you're dreaming. You can't get elected. And of course, it shows you what I know about politics. Yeah. And that was a very interesting campaign. And candid with you that I still was kind of tied to the Kennedy family at that point in time, and had worked hard in Bobby Kennedy's campaign up till the time that he was murdered in the California situation. And as a result of that, I kind of was following Shriver's campaign at that point in time. Never got really involved in it, but felt allegiance that I couldn't get involved in the Carter campaign. And of course, you know, the rest of it became history. And then you got to realize that Ed Campbell was somebody that I really looked up to. Mm-hmm. And when Ed Campbell got involved in the elections with the governor of Arkansas named Clinton, that was kind of, you know, here's the guy to get behind. And I don't think that anybody ever got to the depth of really understanding what the political system in the United States is like any better than what Clinton did, and how he could put things in perspective. And I say that to the extent that if Hillary runs, and if she does, it's going to be because Bill Clinton wants her to run.
Right. And
obviously he's out there at the present time seeing that that's be done. But she's going to be a force, and she's going to be a force because of Bill Clinton. And not only that, but she's good on her own. Don't get me wrong. I'm not putting her down at all. I got all the respect in the world of the job that she's done as Secretary of State in the Obama campaign, and I think she deserves that.
Can I ask you a couple questions about the Kennedy connection?
Sure.
Did you ever meet John or Bobby?
Yes.
Both?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, you want the funny story was that we were down at the Holiday Inn South after the Polk County Convention and of 1968. I got to think of it, 60, 64, yeah, 68. And they said, Ed, somebody wants on the phone. And I went over and answered the phone, and they wanted the Polk County chairman, who was Mike Doyle at that time. And he said that this is Ted Kennedy, and I'd like to talk to Mike. And I said, just a minute. So I went out and told Mike, I said, Mike, Ted Kennedy's on the phone, wants to talk to you. And, oh, yeah, sure. He went in, he said, who's pulling this joke? Well, it was Ted Kennedy. And what he wanted to know was what we'd done with the delegates that night in Polk County. And so the other story, one of the conventions, and I don't remember which one it was, but I was chair of the convention, and I had a heck of a headache, and I went to the room that we had reserved there and was sleeping. Somebody came in and started talking to me, and they were asking me questions that were pretty deep into politics about Polk County and the 5th Congressional District. And at that time, all of a sudden I woke up and I was talking to Ted Kennedy, and he'd come in the room where I was, and so he and I got pretty well acquainted with each other.
So in 1980, Ted Kennedy decides to run for president and take on Jimmy Carter. Did you take sides in that one?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that. That was kind of an interesting time for the Democratic Party, right?
Yes, it was. There wasn't any question about it. But the Kennedy name was magic, and you know, if it hadn't been for Chapman Quiddick, Ted would have been elected president. That's all there was to it. That tragedy haunted him the rest of his life, and he carried that. By the same token, there wasn't anybody that the only one that I know of that even compared to the Kennedys, of course, was Ted O'Neill, and his famous line, "You know, all politics is local." But I'm acquainted quite well with downtown Boston and the area around Boston, so it was very interesting to me as to the elections that had taken place there in the past and the historic elections. But now, if a Kennedy was going to run at that point in time, I was going to be with him. That was all there was to it.
So you met both John and Bobby during their lifetimes, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And Ted.
And Ted. With Ted's campaign, did you get actively involved at the caucus level, or were you doing something more statewide?
No, I didn't do anything statewide, but I did on the caucus level within Polk County. And here, yes.
When I've talked to other people for this film interview project, they've talked about how really friends were on both sides of the fence, so to speak. Some thought they needed to support Carter, and others were for Kennedy.
If you go through the conventions back, you know, when you had Bob Kennedy and Humphrey and McCarthy. Well, the three of them, you know, when we went into that convention at Tech High School at that time, that convention on the delegates were almost to a person were divided 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and you know, people that were your friends. I headed up the Kennedy campaign. Dwight James headed up the McCarthy campaign, and then you had people over with the labor union behind Humphrey, and you know, we were friends. That's all there was to it. It was a tough time. We came out of that convention, Kennedy, and that's where your proportionate representation came into being, was out of what took place during that campaign. And we came out of there, you know, and it was winner take all. And the Kennedy campaign, you know, put the other two down. Now we got to go back and mend the fences. You know, these are our supporters, and you know, we're only 1/3 of the delegates, but we've got all the delegates.
But back in 1968, if Bobby Kennedy had lived, would he have been our nominee?
Oh yes, and our president. Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was the brains there. Bobby Kennedy was despised by a lot of people because of his tenacity, and he was brutal.
Yeah.
He politically brutal. You know, if you're not with me, you're against me. You know, there's no, you get off that fence because there's no fence for you to be on.
Yeah.
But no, he'd have been president.
With Ted's campaign in 1980, were you able to carry your caucuses here in Altoona, or how did those go? Do you remember?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
I had to think back, but yes, we did. But you keep in mind at that time, a guy by the name of John Getters was our precinct captain here, and John was he could hold the group together, and did. And of course, he was a Kennedy supporter.
Well, as you went forward from 1980, were there any other significant presidential campaigns that you were involved in? That you mentioned Bill Clinton in 1992. Anything in '84? That was a Mondale Hart race. Did you remember which side you took on that one?
Well, I was with Mondale all the way, and that has to do with Humphrey and had to do with Minnesota and the Minnesota politics, which was natural for me. So then there came a time in there that in that race that you're talking about too was Gephardt kind of came to the front.
Yes.
And we hosted Jack Bishop put together a fundraiser for Gephardt at Adventureland, and so we did some work for Gephardt in that race at the time. But that's the one before the one you're talking about.
Yeah, I think in 1988, Gephardt was definitely a strong candidate. That was Dukakis and those guys, because Gephardt was thought to be the leader for the nomination in '92 if he decided to run, but he didn't.
That's true.
Remember, he became the kind of the leader of the House in Congress about 1990. Just said, if I do this, I'm not going to run for president anymore. But Gephardt was somebody that you had a close relationship with as well. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, he and his wife. I don't remember all of them, but you know, I remember spending time with. I think his wife's name was Jane, and we spent time at Macadage's together.
So in '88, you would have been you got on with the Gephardt campaign rather than the caucus, right?
Yes.
Gephardt did very well here in Iowa. I know that he ran a strong race. And then in 1992, did you get on with the Clinton folks?
Well,
Tom Harker was running.
You walk that fine line,
Yeah.
but there was always Ed Campbell back here saying this is where you're going to be, and that's where you were.
You were with Tom Harkin until he dropped out.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's exactly how that works.
Uh-huh. All right. So going forward from 1992, anything special happened in that period of time that was obviously you had a lot of respect for Clinton, worked hard to help get him elected in '92. Any other significant races during that time?
I don't think so. Candid with you, that the one candidate that I never was able to really feel comfortable with was Al Gore, right?
Uh-huh.
It's one of those things that sticks in your craw as you're in politics. But if you'll remember, Al Gore skipped Iowa, and of course being involved in the party politics, that's a no-no. If you're going to run, you got to get in here right with us. And I was afraid of any support for Al Gore was going to result in us not having the Iowa caucus, which would have been a disaster for the state of Iowa. We would have never had the political clout that we've mustered now over the past 12 years if that had happened. So, that Al Gore was never one of my favorites. That's all I can say.